Thank you very much for joining us today for the Supply Chain Security and Risk Management Virtual Summit. Today I'm going to be talking with Victor Garcia. And Victor has corporate and private supply chain and transportation logistics security and risk mitigation experience. So he gives us a very unique perspective on how organizations can better their processes for a robust and resilient supply chain security program. Victor, I want to thank you very much for being with us. And could you please kind of go over some of your experiences and talk about what organizations can do for their supply chain lanes?
Yeah, I sure can. George, it's great to see you, and thanks for having me. So as mentioned, I spent about, I would say roughly between 7 and 8 years in corporate America on the logistics front. Responsibilities and objectives, of course, dealt with pick, pack, and ship, distribution of high-tech equipment, and really developing relationships with outbound transportation providers. There was a number of reasons why we had to do that. Obviously, to meet customer expectation for the products that they ordered. But there was one really unique thing that I found in all of my experiences on the logistics and transportation front, and that was the magic of distribution. And what I mean by that is more times often than not that we would find that when we loaded 53-foot trailers, for example, and we'd close the doors on these trailers, magically customers would receive their products, almost as if it was a Christmas surprise. Nobody ever really thought about all of the details that happen from the time you close that dock door to the time a customer actually received their goods. So I didn't realize exactly all of the intricate details involved in moving products actually from the dock door to the customer's door. So my focus was on on-time performance, on-time delivery, making sure we didn't have any damaged product. So in order to be able to hit those objectives, we had to have strong relationships with our service providers. All of those distribution providers understanding how to care for the product, setting the expectations up front. But not only that, George, it was very imperative that those distribution providers understood the standards of care that we had in place for our customers. Customers expected a higher level of delivery, a higher level of service. So those relationships had to be strong. As I progressed throughout my career, I took advantage of an opportunity that came to me on the supply chain security front. So it actually took me outside of corporate America, if you will, and took me into the private space. And so what I got a chance to see then was I got to see how other industries, how other companies, how other individuals ran their businesses on the outbound distribution front. So that was really unique for me because I'd always been the guy working the dock door and closing those doors and shipping products out. And now I got to see how other companies were doing it and what was important to them. From a supply chain security perspective, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that for a second. One of the things I never thought about was the potential risk of theft. So as we shut the dock doors and transportation providers carried our goods to our customers, to the end users, we just knew that it happened. We didn't think about any risk. We didn't think about any delays. We only knew that some magic dust sometimes happened and customers would get the products that they ordered. On the supply chain security side, it's a very different story because you see the risks, you hear about the gaps, and you understand and you begin to put the pieces of the puzzle together that once that dock door closes, that's when the real work begins.
And Victor, one of the things that you had an opportunity to do when you were working with these organizations that I saw personally was you optimized their supply chain security lanes because you were able to look at organizations and say, you know, you're running a certain expense on your supply chain logistics program, but you're also leaving this part vulnerable. And you were able to take, you could say, look, let's save you some money here. Let's redistribute some of these lanes or some of this value that you have in the security program over to here. And then you can broaden your scope of what's actually being secured for organizations. And I know a lot of that came from your experience in corporate security and then truly understanding what it meant to have a good, robust supply chain security program.
So George, when you're talking about supply chain optimization, I mean, that's absolutely key. In fact, it's quite fundamental to actually saving companies a tremendous amount of money. When we talk about supply chain optimization, we're really understanding the lanes of transportation and how efficient they are. All modes of transportation, both domestic and international, times of day, even Mother Nature herself and how she impacts our distribution, our supply chain, and things of that sort. So understanding exactly how those models work and looking for opportunities to optimize was in fact something that I did have an opportunity to play in. Using different technologies, using different data feeds and different methods of collecting data, you could actually look at performance and trends as distribution providers or transportation providers, how they were handling our products, how they were handling the goods. Were there dwell times? Were there unexpected delays? Were there unforeseen delays? Or in fact, were there delays that we saw coming that we just didn't say anything about? Or maybe that we prevented and actually optimized the supply chain as it was happening in progress. So those are the kinds of things that I had an opportunity to work with different companies about, being on the outside of corporate America and understanding exactly what was most important to the customer. What's most important to the customer is being able to provide an outstanding service for the end user, if it's a transportation provider, and if it's an end user, getting expectation of quality, expectation of product, expectation of service. And so where customers spend the most money, in many cases, is where those products sit, where they don't move, where they have unexpected breaks in their supply chain. Maybe they're unforeseen breaks. Maybe they're actually just trends that can be avoided if studied and looked at. And I think that's where we found we had plenty of opportunities. And I think there are still plenty of customers out there that see these opportunities if just taking a strong, hard look at transportation trends. Even shipping time of day matters in order to meet those customers' expectations. And in today's world, you have to exceed those expectations if you want to remain competitive.
You know, it's interesting you talk about expectations, because how many times have we gone into organizations, start asking them questions about their supply chain, and it's amazing how much they don't know about their own supply chains. So how do you start setting expectations? Is that something you would start taking people because you understood that, or is it something that you found that most people actually did have a pretty good idea of what their expectations were, so you were able to go in and optimize that?
You know, George, when you and I used to travel the circuit and go to these conferences and talk to different potential customers when we were together, it was really using previous experiences and leveraging those experiences to ask the right questions about internal organizations. It's really that simple. So in corporate America, again, afforded me many of opportunities to work with different organizations, from procurement to finance to supply chain, even service parts and warranty, and understanding how all of those organizations work together. Although they own their own lanes and they own their own pieces of the pie, if you know a little bit about each one of those organizations and how it ultimately impacts not just the P&L of the organization, but how it impacts the expectation of the customer, you can take those experiences and you can take them to other customers, being a third-party provider, and help understand. Have you spoken to the procurement department about potential efficiencies? Have you spoken to finance about potential savings? You know, back when I was in logistics, I had to work with the procurement teams because they were the ones that wrote the contracts for the transportation providers. My job was to make the transportation provider's performance better. It was always to improve whomever it was the contract was written for. So I had to understand exactly what procurement roles was. I also had to understand the expectations from our executives as to how those providers were to execute, and also understand what my customers' expectations were. Many of the times, customers' expectations were internal. So the sales folks, the sales makers, those were the guys that were keeping an eye on us to make sure we were executing with our partners. So I think that's one of the key takeaways from understanding the elements of supply, not just supply chain optimization or security, but using those corporate experiences that when you are talking to potential customers, is to not just focus on one particular lane, such as the security department or even the logistics department. All of those organizations have some facet of procurement and finance, logistics, transportation, service warranties, things of that nature that all can benefit from the types of data that your company collects or other third-party company collects, and use that data to create efficiencies. It's not any different than we all do in our daily lives anyway, even at home, whether it's optimizing your checkbook or optimizing the way that you maneuver around your home to create efficiencies. All in all, it's really the same principle. It's really the same discipline. It's just taking those efficiencies and applying them in the job space.
And what do you think are some of the best things that organizations can do to stay proactive and efficient in securing their supply chains?
Well, so I think one of the most important things that you have to understand is just the fundamentals of how the operation is delivering its service or its products. So in order to optimize any supply chain, you have to understand how the supply chain works from beginning to end. Now, understand, it's not a question as to, do I have to understand how each function operates in order to understand the full supply chain methodology? That's not necessarily the case. But it is important to understand from beginning to end exactly what the objectives are, exactly what the final products are at each of its phases, at each of its stages, and ultimately, what is the desired result? It isn't until you put those pieces of the puzzle together that you begin to understand, and you maybe even begin to actually see where some potential gaps are. You don't have to be an expert in each one of those areas, but it is important to understand at least at base level what each one of those functions produces, what each one of those functions' objectives are, so that ultimately, from a transportation perspective, if you take into account security, optimization, visibility, all of those things are so important because, like I mentioned earlier, once you close the door on that trailer or that transportation vehicle, that's when the real work begins. Because at the end of that journey, there's some customer out there that's expecting something. And when that door closes, it better be right.
Absolutely. And one of the things that you and I were always passionate about was a command center, because you talk about these different parts of the organization that all have to communicate amongst themselves, but they generally work in silos. So there has to be some place that is a main focus point for communication. And generally that is a command center. What are some of the things that organizations can do that have command centers to make their command center better, or to make their command center help out in the mitigation of risk for the supply chains?
Well, I think to be able to answer that question, you have to understand two things. There's a difference between a command center and a monitoring center. So, as you and I have worked together in the past, and we've traveled the country, we've seen a variety of monitoring centers and we've seen a variety of command centers. Times have changed. Information is automatic. Information is instantaneous. Every one of us carries one of these things around as our lifeline every single day. News updates, weather updates. My child has broken their geofence and I better wrangle them back in, and I get instantaneous updates, things of that sort. So I take that same philosophy into a command center, for example. If we're going to call it a command center, then the command center's responsibility is much like a quarterback on a football team. Understand the different roles and responsibilities of the players or organizations, and understand what their roles are, and be able to coordinate and facilitate all of those functions so they work together as one. The quarterback calls out the signals. The quarterback must know the objective, the end result of the play. So must be the command center. A command center is there to be able to deliver intelligence. As you and I used to call it, actionable intelligence. Give me something I can work with. Give me something that I need to do. Give me something that tells me I can create efficiency, or give me some information that identifies a gap. I'll use some examples like extreme weather situations. If a hurricane is headed towards the East Coast, for example, and I have a command center, it doesn't matter where my command center is. I have customers that are situated in the East Coast. There are a number of different things that we can do proactively to stay in touch with our customers, to let them know we are looking out on their behalf. So if a storm is coming and they have employees in a specific building, if they have data centers and we can help them power down those data centers appropriately, if they have a warehouse full of parts and we want to make recommendations as how to secure those parts in the best measures possible, those are things that we should be able to do ahead of time. We can all see the weather channel, we can all get these alerts on our phones, but not necessarily everybody is paying that close of attention to an interstate that's been shut down due to a fire, or maybe there's some protest, or maybe there's some shutdown due to some earthquake that happened or tremor that has collapsed a bridge. A command center's responsibility is to proactively inform customers of those situations, to show the customer that you are proactively looking out for their best interest, not just for your products, but for their safety as well. A monitoring center Its function is to understand what triggers and what alerts are available to pass on to customers. A command center is there to proactively be able to predict those triggers and those alerts, and to do some intelligent, actionable intelligence that helps the customer survive, if you will. That creates a number of different things. It creates different opportunities for those third-party command centers, or maybe those command centers are internal. But not only can you provide statuses on shipments of products, that's pretty basic. You can provide alerts on delays. That's pretty basic too. But when you can predict and you can provide actionable intelligence, along with those other facets, you truly start to become a real command center and not just a monitoring center. And think about this for a second. That's great if I can predict weather or some catastrophic event that has happened East Coast or on the West Coast. But what about internationally? What happens then? If like many companies today, products are shipped every single day, back and forth overseas on an international scale, sometimes over water, sometimes in the air. In any case, to be able to have that intelligence that says I'm going to experience delays because I know something happened internationally that's preventing us from moving hardware, moving people, whatever the case may be, that's a command center's responsibility. That's a core competency of a command center, in my opinion. I also think that a command center's responsibility is for the care and the welfare, the well-being of their customers. Just think about this for a minute. If you knew where all the customers' data centers were and you knew how many employees were in each data center, anytime an alert of a weather alert, or maybe it's some event, a fire that is causing potential evacuations and things of that sort, there's a business continuity process that you could establish and put in place for that customer. To me, that's the heart of a command center. Not just monitoring and reacting to alerts, but providing actionable intelligence that's more than just about the widget.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. You know, just this morning there was a 7.6, 7.8 earthquake in New Zealand that created a tsunami. And we used to have shipments that would go from Australia to Mexico, and it stopped at the port of Auckland. So knowing, you know, if you had something that had just left Australia and it was heading for that port, you could reach out to a lot of different parties and let them know what is happening, what's occurring. But, you know, it always seems like, well, this organization has it handled, they'll notify them, or this organization has it, or somebody else is going to notify me if something happens, so they're not proactively looking at things. How do you set all that up front? Should that be set up by the corporate side? Or when you were in the third party private security, should private security be going to these organizations saying, look what we can do for you?
Well, so I think the answer to both of those is yes.
Yeah.
Continuity plans and those communications with those organizations should obviously take place. But as you well know, being on the third party side and talking to a lot of these customers, a lot of these organizations work in silos. And it's not just because they don't necessarily all work in the same building, much less in the same city, maybe not even in the same state or country. Organizations are spread out throughout the globe nowadays. So communication, albeit just like you and I are doing right now, it doesn't prohibit business from happening, but it certainly adds an element of challenge, that's for sure. So taking the experience that I have on the corporate side and then taking that on the third party side, you can ask those kinds of questions with those other entities. You remember when you and I were working in Austin, Texas together, and we were making some trips up in the state of Texas, up in the northeast, sometimes up in the Panhandle area. And we were talking to the customers and we were asking them about their other departments and their affiliations and their communications. And some of us would give us those funny looks like, why would I even talk to them? But as we begin to talk about all of the information that's available in supply chain security, supply chain visibility, it becomes more of a discussion of collaboration. It isn't just about fixing one particular problem, which, by the way, is probably the most important element of the discussion with the customer. If you're going to talk about supply chain security and you're going to talk about supply chain visibility, what is the problem that the customer is trying to solve? If you're trying to solve a customer's problem and you know what that problem is, that's fantastic. But sometimes the customer doesn't even know. So taking everything that you've learned going to these conferences that you and I went to, and working collaboratively with these customers, sometimes it's the question that we overlook. And that question is, what do your other colleagues in your other departments say? And what's important to them? Is it security? Is it visibility? Is it a financial mechanism? Is it a procurement trigger? You know, are there other triggers? Is it an inventory-based type mechanism that makes them tick? Taking all of those things into consideration, then the customer begins to realize and understand, listen, we're probably sitting on some pretty powerful information that we could share internally, especially if it means some sort of efficiency, some sort of creativity that's implemented to resolve some problem or fill some gap. You know, until you ask those questions, all you're doing is you're focusing in on one particular problem, one particular issue. But the problem really could span multiple organizations. That's the key, though, is understanding what more does this particular solution have in terms of application.
And Victor, when we used to go to these organizations, you talk about kind of getting that look when you start asking certain questions. We used to have a cartoon that we put in our presentation, if you remember this. It was a couple cavemen who are trying to push a cart with a square stone tire, and there's another caveman standing there with a round one trying to talk to them about, hey, there's a better way to do this. But the cavemen are looking back saying, not now, we're too busy. Now, going back into corporate security, and now you have this different perspective, even than they do, because sometimes people you are working with have been in corporate security their entire life. Are you able to go to them now and say, hold on, guys, time out. Let me tell you this story to make sure we're not falling into that trap? And does that help you with your current position?
Man, that is so funny that you bring that up. I mean, that's real world example today. A lot of times it's the I don't have time. We'll get to you later. Let's set up some time and maybe we'll talk about it another day. Well, sometimes that other day doesn't come, quite frankly. And the customer is potentially missing out on those opportunities. Even where I am today, taking those experiences and saying, hey guys, there's probably a better way than writing the solution on paper and pencil, for example. I'm being a little facetious, but you get the idea. It says we're really just so busy that we don't have time to listen right now. Well, isn't that the irony of it all? Is the solution that we're proposing is to create those efficiencies so that you're busy focusing on true real world problem solving type activities and not just being quote unquote busy. So I remember that cartoon well. In fact, it's ingrained in my head. And really the right approach and the right proposal is to make sure that your voice is heard and understanding that if there's a better way, just take a moment and listen. And if you use real world life examples, those tend to get people's attention in most cases. If you talk dollars and cents, hey, people tend to listen to those too.
Absolutely. Victor, I want to thank you very much for your time. This is a Sunday, and thank you so much for taking some time on the weekend to have this discussion with us. Is there anything you would like to say in closing?
No, George. Hey, listen, I really appreciate you asking me to do this. It was a pleasure speaking with you. I hope you and I get a chance to see each other again in person really soon. I hope the Northeast is taking care of you. We welcome you back home anytime that you wish to come back, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you. Best of luck to you, and let's stay in touch. And hey, have a great week.
Thank you, sir. And I probably won't get out to Austin anytime soon, but you and your family have a safe and happy holidays. And I want to thank everybody else for joining us for this opportunity to speak with Victor, for joining us for the virtual summit. And I'll say it now for everybody out there also, as we get into the holiday season, I want everybody to have a safe and happy holidays. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll talk to you in the next video. Thank you.